I am so excited to introduce this lady to you. I don't know how many of you have read it. Has anybody read this new book that's out? No? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about it. And she is here. Her name is Sally Hoedel. And if she'd come up, she's just a lovely lady. My daughter asked her a while ago, or my son, how did you write an Elvis book? You're too young to know about Elvis.
I hear that a lot.
So, Sally, let's sit down.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Is the sound man going to fire me? So here's the book. And I don't know, she's got some back there for sale. I don't think readers realize how much research there goes into a project like yours. Can you give us just an overview of how you go about writing a book?
Sure, it was much harder than even I thought it would be, I have to say. And I have a journalism degree from MSU. I had done a lot of writing. My husband and I own a curriculum business that creates materials for high schools and teaches character and leadership lessons, so I did a lot of writing for that. He had written books, and still, surprising, it's 4 years from idea to holding it in my hand. In terms of research, it starts with a lot of reading, as any research does. And I've been an Elvis fan since I was 10 years old, so I had read a lot of the books, but I had to reread them. And it's so interesting because this does cover his health issues. And how many of the books that I had read where there would be an ailment talked about or a health episode talked about, a little blurb in every book, but not a lot. But when you put it all together, there was a pattern.
Yes.
There was a pattern. So that was fascinating to read those 100 Elvis books, many of which I'd read before, and then see them in a different way as well. And then the reading didn't stop with Elvis, because then I had to understand his medical issues.
Exactly. And so you had to research medical journals and the like.
Read medical journals, understand it, and then be able to write it in a way that everybody else could understand it as well. Because this is not a medical book, it is an Elvis book.
Yes.
So that was important. And then one of the most important things for me was to read about everything from a historical standpoint. We cannot look at history through a 2021 lens. We have to look at history through the lens of when it happened. So when we're talking about Elvis's ancestors and why poverty keeps being handed on down the tree over and over.
Right.
A friend of mine said, so are you in the writing part now? And I said, well, I was, but I had to stop. Now I'm researching Reconstruction in Mississippi after the Civil War. And it's like, I thought you were writing an Elvis book.
She's not kidding. And when you read the book, the first part of it that has so much of the history that she diligently found, I almost stopped. I did actually stop and take notes. The research that Sally did on Elvis's family on both sides, his father and his mother's side, is just amazing. I mean, as an Elvis fan, we knew some of it, and of course we knew Uncle Vester and people like that. And I was fortunate enough to know Janelle McComb, and she told me a lot of things about Tupelo days. But how did you go about that research? I mean, I'm taking notes. I'm going like, wow, the Smith family and the Presley family, they are really, and I'm trying to make the family tree more or less.
Sure, and that's exactly what I did. Again, it started with the reading. That turned into talking to doctors and all of that, but the family tree part is so important, and it is my favorite part of the book. It is the first couple chapters.
It was my too.
Because I love ancestry. I've done my own family tree. I've done a lot of research on that over the years, and I have to tell you that Ancestry.com was a huge resource in this. It started with Elaine Dundee's research in Elvis and Gladys, which that was old school ancestry research, where she lived in Tupelo for a while and was at the city hall and the library and all those places pulling those documents. But now, so much of it is online. So I was able to build a tree, and one way in particular that helped through that website was discovering Larry Presley, who really is someone that no one had ever talked to before. And he was a son of Noah Presley, who I believe to be a very big influence in Elvis's life. And I couldn't believe he had a child that was still alive. But Noah had been married twice, so there were a lot of children over a long period of time.
Oh, so that Presley thing started with him.
And Larry was the youngest, but he gave a perspective to this era that had really been long gone. But he was the youngest child of Noah, and Noah was a huge influence. So when I reached out to Larry, I was able to share with him his father's World War I draft card, which I found on Ancestry.com, and he did not have. So he was like,
awesome. So he thought you were wonderful.
Yes, he's like, thank you so much for sending that, and I'd like to know about your father, and of course he was willing to share after that. So Ancestry.com was a huge resource, and then just building upon what other people have researched, and then adding in that medical component. For example, Doll, we were told that Doll had tuberculosis forever, right?
Right.
But when you research tuberculosis, it does not make sense that she had tuberculosis. It just ends up being one of those family things that gets passed on down the tree, and when you really analyze it, it just doesn't hold up, so.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of his family, do you think there's a person in his family that you think it was the most important during the Tupelo years?
Well, during the Tupelo, obviously is Vernon and Gladys, right?
Of course.
Gladys gets so much credit, but what I really discovered in my research is that the three of them created their own little insular world and relied on each other very much. But outside of that, I think it's Noah Presley, and I do want to do more research and delve into that relationship more, because Noah owned a grocery store in Tupelo, and especially when Vernon was in prison, that's where Gladys and Elvis got their food from.
Really?
And they were not charged.
Yeah.
And then in later years, little Elvis would be sent to the store, and everybody I talked to in Tupelo said, I don't know how Noah ever made money in his grocery store, because he gave everything away because people could not pay for it at the time, that he would hope they'd pay overtime.
When they could, yeah.
So Elvis would go and pick up what Gladys asked him to pick up, and he would leave with a Coke and a candy bar, is the story that Larry Presley tells about his dad. And I firmly believe that that is the root of Elvis's generosity. That he learned it from Noah.
Absolutely.
So, very important.
Yeah. And Noah's buried there, right?
Noah is in the plot where they believe that Jesse, the twin, is buried.
Yeah.
Noah was Vernon's uncle, the brother of Vernon's father. But he really stepped up and took care of the whole Presley clan. The men are notorious for leaving and abandoning the women quite a bit, and you see that in the book throughout the tree. But Noah, at 20 years old, in one of the census reports, he is listed as the head of the household.
Really? At 20?
At 20, and his mother, who claims to be widowed but never married, is living with him. And he really was, at 20, the head of this huge Presley family. And he just took on the responsibility that no one else did. Yeah. And again, I think Elvis learned that from him too.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Gladys a little bit. How important was she in piecing together some of this health information? We all know that she was ill shortly before she passed away, but earlier than we thought. Did she have some problems?
Absolutely. I always say that Elvis is such a victim of sensationalism, and his relationship with his mother is an issue of romanticism. That relationship has been romanticized to the point where it's not accurate any longer, unfortunately. They were very close, obviously. He loved his mother, no question. But there's this misnomer out there that he became famous, they moved to Graceland, he was gone, she was so sad that it killed her. And it's just not true. We now know from my research that she had a cardiologist as early as the Audubon House. So that's early 1956. Elvis himself calls the cardiologist's house and says, my mother has been referred to you. We'd like to make an appointment. We'd like to see you.
Elvis took care of that himself.
Yes, because I wanted to talk to the cardiologist, but unfortunately he already passed, so I thought, well, I'll reach out to his daughter and see if that leads anywhere. Turns out that his daughter would go on the house calls with him. And yes, she was 10, and she went on the house calls, and first to Audubon, and then to Graceland. So this is a first-hand account, and she also still has medical records because the father also became Elvis's doctor for a while, and Vernon and Minnie Mae and everybody. But initially, Gladys's cardiologist. So it's not normal to need a cardiologist when you're in your 40s. There was major health,
especially back then,
major health issues with Gladys. And the fact that Elvis made that phone call, and the funny story attached to that is he called 3 times because they kept hanging up on him. Like, sure, you're not Elvis Presley, you know. No, really, my mom is sick, I need help, you know. So eventually they realized he really was Elvis, and there's a little story in the book that goes along with that. But she was a wealth of information, and again, no one had ever talked to her. So the fact that...
Isn't this good? Isn't she special?
The fact that Gladys had a cardiologist that early, it means that Gladys was very sick. She was not just sad. And I believe we've, you know, identified the disease that she has, and that's all in the book. But it means that they also knew how sick she was. So when everybody is so sad in all those pictures, when Elvis is leaving to go to the army, it's not just that he's going in the army. They know.
They know that
They know. They kept it private, because that's what people did. They kept their health private, but they knew how sick Gladys was, and they knew it was probably a short amount of time that they had to be together.
Makes very good sense. So, I see, isn't that exciting? Didn't she have fun? We'll do it, well, not fun, but interesting, finding all this stuff out. Your book challenges the narrative that has been told now for decades about Elvis, and did that make you nervous that your book is controversial, shall we say?
You know, I knew it would be controversial, but I also knew it was true, so I didn't think about the controversial part so much, because there are 32 pages of citation in the back. Elvis is rarely, I won't say never, but rarely given that level of integrity in any kind of project. You know, I wanted everybody to know exactly where all this information came from. So I knew I wrote the book with integrity from start to finish.
Absolutely.
And by the time it's done, you have to put it out there and see what people think. Like, you just have to. And I knew this was such an important element of Elvis's story. It impacts his entire legacy.
It really is.
It does. So I was a little nervous, but I also understood that I know I'm asking a lot from everyone. I am asking you to think differently from what you've been told to think for decades. And that's asking a lot. I say all the time that this book requires an open mind. I will also say that my biggest critics are those who refuse to read the book.
And here's the thing about the book, and I've read, my bookshelf is full of Elvis books, and I've read probably most of them. When I got into Sally's book, it was like I was going back to school. Like I said, I'm like getting into the genealogy and going like, man, I knew the Presley family, so I'm taking notes. It's like I was in school. I'm taking notes so I can remember and go on to the next part. And your notes in the back, I went back and forth with those too. Now, who told her that, and how did she find out that?
Right, and some of that, I was just telling the story earlier, because, you know, John Daly is supposed to be here, and he's not.
Right.
But I wanted to tell this story and for him to hear it. You know, I had gone to Memphis several times to interview, and the beautiful part of this is that I'm friends with people who knew Elvis, and people like yourself as well. It's just amazing, right?
Yeah.
But I had met Tish Henley Kirk for the first time, and now they're great friends, and she was his nurse from '68 on. She would go on tour with him, so a wealth of information, incredibly helpful. Like, the minute I sat down with her, she was like, "You're right.
Yeah.
Someone needs to write this," you know, and she was very helpful with that. But I met John Daly that same day, and skeptical as anybody would be with what I was presenting, because it is a little, you know, it's a controversial subject, Elvis dying. And this book really is much more about his life than his death, I'm sure you would agree, and how he struggled.
Oh, absolutely.
But I was telling John about it, and met him that day. Thought, that went pretty well. Like, we talked for a couple hours. I get a call that evening, and he says, "Are you in town still tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, I have some documents that I think would be really helpful to your research, and I want to share them with you. Can we meet for breakfast? Can we meet for breakfast?" And there was information in there that was instrumental to piecing all of this together. So I call it Elvis magic, just meeting the right person at the right time, and it happened time and time again over those 4 years, and since this book has come out as well. It's just amazing.
It is. It's just fascinating. It really is. It's a different type of book, but it is about Elvis. It is about his family, and if you've been an Elvis fan for a long time, or if you're new to the Elvis world, you'll be captivated. It was just went on and on.
I was too, doing the research, because I've been an Elvis fan my whole life, so I couldn't believe the things that pieced together and fell in place, and it was fun for me to write and piece that together too, because as Elvis fans, we read all the books because we're left with more questions usually, right, than answers, and it answered questions for me, so I was excited to share that.
What do you say to the people who choose to ask you about his use of prescription medication? I mean, it's very evident in the book that Elvis needed care and medications and stuff, but how do you answer the, you know, his,
the people who think it's an excuse, right?
Yeah.
And there are a number of those. Like you've made up this whole story to excuse away the real drug problem that Elvis had. Well, first of all, there are 32 pages of citations. I didn't make anything up. But secondly, you know, the thing with Elvis that's sometimes complicated, often complicated, is that you have to hold two things in tandem at the same time. And they're opposites, but they're both true. And it happens throughout his story.
Yeah.
It does.
True.
And yes, he developed a problem with prescription medication. And yes, he needed prescription medication for a number of the ailments.
Right.
And certainly at the end to function. He could not have been Elvis Presley with the ailments he had without the medication. There's just no question about that, in my opinion. And so often the medication is just listed. Like he died, he had all all these drugs in his system. No one ever, like Hoedel, for example, in '78, he just listed all the medication, and he did not explain what one of them was there for. And a number of them had a purpose, and even the medication that had a purpose had tolerance issues, addiction issues. And when you're taking this stuff for 20 years because you have these real health ailments, addiction is almost inevitable.
Then you become addicted. Some medications are like that.
Yes, and that's all explained in the book. But the main idea is that he was self-medicating in the beginning. He had these health ailments. Growing up poor, he did see his access to health care as an accomplishment. And in some way that leads to the situation he got himself into. But he's proud that he can provide that for his family. He's proud to have his own doctor.
So how do you hope this book will fit in with the Elvis legacy and history?
Well, the most important thing for me is that I really want Elvis, his story, to be seen as one of not self-destruction. Elvis's story is, I think in pop culture, always written off as one of self-destruction. That's kind of the main historical vibe, right? I want it to be seen as a futile struggle to survive instead, because that's what it was. And first he has to survive through extreme poverty, and then he has to survive through fame that no one before him had ever experienced.
No one ever, right?
Or since.
Or since,
And
right?
then he had to survive all of these health ailments. And that's a lot of survival. And you know, the main agenda too with Elvis is that he's not trying to be the king of rock and roll. He's not trying to be the most famous person to ever live. He's trying to be a provider for his family. And he's trying to pull his mother and his father and other relatives out of poverty. And even when he's really sick in the late 70s and people say, you're sick, you need to stop. And he says, I can't. Too many people rely on me. Like, it is the common thread through his whole story is being a provider. So I want people to know that too.
That's right. And it starts when he was very young, very young.
Very young, very, very young. And the other thing I really want people to take away from it is I see Elvis very much as a Henry Ford, a Thomas Edison, a George Washington. He is a historical figure. He's not just a rock and roll star. He culturally shifted the universe in the same way as electricity and cars.
Exactly.
You know, and
he was that big of a force.
Yes. So if we remove the sensationalism, we stop looking at him through the very narrow lens of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You will humanize him, and you will see the struggle, and you will see how much he overcame, and then his story is even more incredible.
It really is. It really is. So I think Sally has done all of us a big favor by writing the story and doing this research, and we thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for reading it. Thank you for the open mind and all the support. Okay, I so appreciate it.
So everybody stop by and visit Sally, because you can tell what a wonderful gal she is. I'm just so happy that we met.
Me too, and absolutely. And if you do decide to get it and you read it, my email address is on the back. I want to know what you think. I want your feedback. It's really important too. Because we're all in this together. We're all Elvis fans. Like,
all part of the family.
We all want him to be elevated to where he should be. And I wrote this book for Elvis, 110%, like, because his legacy deserves it. So the more people that read it.
It's so interesting. It's just captivating. I have to say, when I picked it up, I read it. I couldn't put it. Was one of those that you can't put down. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can talk to you and enjoy.